non-human intelligence exists, it is interacting with our planets, and that interaction is ongoing. And there are people in the defense and intelligence community who are aware of this interaction. If you don't believe what I've just said, here is Colonel Carl Nell saying exactly the same thing.
Non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
Pretty impressive for the deputy CTO of Northrop Grumman, one of the world's biggest defense and aerospace companies. If you're still not convinced, truthfully, honestly, this video is probably not going to be for you, because today we're taking for granted that the UFO phenomenon is real and that it's interacting with us. And we're going to be asking the next question, which happens when you're in this world of ufology, which is, what is it doing? Why is it here, and what are its purposes? And when you ask that question, very quickly, the extraterrestrial hypothesis becomes kind of challenging. And if there's one person who's helped our entire field challenge the extraterrestrial hypothesis and think in bigger ways, there's no one better than Jacques Vallee. Jacques Vallee is an astrophysicist, a computer scientist. He contributed to the founding of the internet. The precursor of the internet was the ARPANET, which he helped develop. He also helped to map Mars. He contributed to that project. He's done some pretty incredible things. He's a very bright, intelligent person. For those of us in ufology, we see him really as, I guess, the godfather of our field, one of the most mature, thoughtful, incisive thinkers. And recently I've been reading one of his best books, Messengers of Deception, for the first time. You can see my copy is relatively battered, full of marks. It's been on a lot of journeys with me. I took this reading seriously. You know why? Because at this point, I've read, I think, 8 of Jacques Vallee's books. And although I've loved them all, I've never come away feeling like I can clearly articulate exactly what it is that he believes and what it is that he's trying to say. And so this time I thought, right, I'm really going to chew this over and make sure I get it. Make sure I truly get it right down to my core. What is Vallee saying about UFOs and the UFO phenomenon? And today, it's going to be a bit of a different video. And I'm going to walk you through what Vallee teaches us about the UFO phenomenon and the conclusions that he reaches. At a high level, this is what he says. Obviously, this stuff is real, but the extraterrestrial hypothesis doesn't make sense. Instead, we should look not so much at where it's coming from, because that's quite hard to answer, but let's look at what it's doing here on this planet to try and see its motivations and the impact that it's having socially. And what he identifies is a consistent social impact that this phenomenon has been having on our world, on the way that we think, on the people who have contact with these technologies, and the way that they then go and change society and interact with society. He highlights exactly what that impact is. And some of that is very alarming. The other really remarkable thing that Vallee talks about in this book is something that challenges the very core of how we think about this phenomenon. In 1977, which is when this book was written, Vallee was relatively convinced that human beings could mimic the UFO phenomenon and its technology. That is, he felt that we had the psychotronic, mind control, and other technologies required to create the experiences that we might associate with an abduction or with a contact experience. In 1977. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through exactly how he gets to this point, the arguments that he makes, so that you can walk away understanding what one of the greatest thinkers of our time in terms of UFOs really thinks about this topic, and also coming away with some of the disturbing implications of that for how we think about what is going on today. Is it possible that what we're seeing amplify all around us in 2025? Is it possible that a portion of that is being simulated? Is it possible that the defense and intelligence agencies, even back in 1977, had the means and capabilities to simulate the UFO phenomenon and contact experiences? And if that was possible 50 years ago, as we reach this climax in 2025, 2026, 2027, what might be going on? Super important questions for us to be able to answer, and we're going to be able to answer them better by walking through this together. One of the first things Vallee does, pretty much right from the outset of the book, is he challenges the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And he does this in 3 ways. Firstly, he looks at the volume of landing cases. Then he looks at the behavior of the ufonauts, the beings that come out of these craft and the way they interact. And then he looks at the physics of the craft and the sorts of things they can do. So let's walk through those 3 relatively quickly. Firstly, one of the points he makes early on is there's just too many landings. So Vallee says that over the course of 20 years, he's identified 2,000 very good landing cases that he feels very confident about the witnesses, the quality of the data. And he highlights that these only happen within a few hours in the evening. And the reason he says for that is because people go to bed at 10:30. So he says, look, what would happen if people stayed up all night? Based on the number of cases that he's documented, if people stayed up all night and looked for these craft, how many would they see? And he speculates it'd be somewhere in the region of 30,000. He then makes the point that we know from scientific studies of unusual phenomenon that only 1 in 10 cases is ever reported. So he multiplies 30,000 by 10, which gets you to 300,000. And then he points out that if these craft are actually coming here to do some clandestine activity that's real from another world, then there's no reason why they would only appear in human populated areas, right? They would also be doing their scientific studies or whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing in non-human populated areas, which then multiplies it by another factor of 10, because humans are only seeing them at certain times, in certain places, and then only reporting so much. So that's how you get those multipliers of 10. This is what you would call back of the cigarette packet mathematics, but it gets Vallee to a number of 3 million landing cases. Now let's say he's slightly off, right? Let's slice it by 10 down to 300,000 landing cases. The point he's making is, what are they doing? What are they doing? If they have the technology to travel from another star system, from another galaxy, and they're coming here, by the way, visually as well, so many different species of them, what are they all doing? And this is where you get that idea of why don't they just land on the White House lawn? The data shows us that they're here, but what they're doing seems frankly ridiculous. So he points out that this whole idea that extraterrestrials are landing to do some scientific studies in a clandestine way doesn't really add up. The next point that Vallee makes is about the beings themselves as they come out of the crafts. He makes a few important points here. Firstly, they're all humanoid. You know, they all have sort of 2 arms, 2 legs, which is fine in terms of convergent evolution. Maybe that is what would happen if you had these beings appearing on different planets. With the right principles, humanoid shapes would come. Okay. But the fact that they can all deal with our gravity and that they can all breathe our air seems kind of crazy, right? If you just watch one of those videos about the gravity of the different planets in our solar system, you quickly begin to realize that it is not the same and that we would hardly be able to stand on any other planet apart from our own. So these beings seem to break that rule. They all come here, walk out of their craft, having a wonderful day, and breathe our air, and it seems totally fine for them. So that's another point where he highlights, isn't that kind of strange for extraterrestrial beings? And finally, Vallee highlights the way that the craft themselves work. He documents a few cases from his files where he highlights that these craft behave in frankly strange ways. Here are some examples. March 1954, Santa Maria, Brazil. A man observed 2 occupants of a football-shaped craft who spoke in a strange language. The craft vanished silently and instantly. June 1962, Verona, Italy. Following a UFO observation, a woman was awakened by a feeling of intense cold and saw a being with a bald head near the house. She called other witnesses, and all saw the apparition shrink and vanish on the spot, and he quotes them here, like a TV image when the set is turned off. October 1963, Whidbey Island, Washington State. A middle-aged woman saw a strange craft with 3 figures inside. It tilted, partially sank into the ground, grew in size, and departed with a flash. And finally, November 1968, France. A prominent doctor saw 2 large disc-shaped objects merge into one, and the single object sent a beam of light in his direction. It vanished with a sort of explosion, leaving a cloud that dissipated slowly. So this is what Vallee says in conclusion to these cases. I hardly need to point out that this behavior is contrary to what physical objects do, and quite impossible to duplicate with our current spacecraft technology. It is the behavior of an image, or a holographic projection. Yet at other times, the objects seem to have left material traces. There may be a machine involved, but a machine that remains out of view of the witnesses, who only see what it is projecting. When we go to the movies, we look at the objects and the people on the screen. We do not stare at the projector. That final quote is very interesting. I wonder if some of you might be thinking right now about the 5 observables that Lou Elizondo listed when he first came out all those years ago. Hypersonic velocity, instantaneous lifts, no observable flight surfaces. I can't remember them all, but one of them was transmedium travel. And it seemed like what he was encouraging us to believe was like, wow, look, this technology can fly through mountains, oceans, skies. It doesn't seem to be affected by the changes in the physics and the chemistry and the actual thing that it's interacting with. It can just move through it. It's interesting hearing Vallee talk about the idea that an actual explanation of that might not be that this is some really advanced technology, but rather that it might be a projection, a holographic image of some kind. It also makes me think of Plato's allegory of the cave. You know, the story where he talks about these people inside of a cave and they're seeing these shadows on the wall. And they don't realize those shadows are being caused by people standing behind them who are putting objects in front of a light to cause those shadows. The idea is that these humans believe that they're seeing reality, when in reality the projector, to use Vallee's version of this here, is behind them, and that's the thing that's causing what they're seeing in front of them. And of course then Plato's allegory then goes further, which is there's actually a world outside of the cave where you don't even need projectors because there's sunlight, right? There's a whole world you can't even imagine. I think it's really interesting to hold those two things together here with what Vallee's saying. The idea that the UFO data doesn't look like physical craft sometimes. It turns off like a TV set. It dissipates into a cloud of smoke. It seems more like an apparition or a hologram than a real physical device. And this is what really pivots him into asking, okay, well, how do we understand this? If this isn't extraterrestrial, because of the number of landings, the beings, the behavior of the craft, what might it be? And if someone is projecting a hologram, an image, into our reality, they must be doing it for a purpose. And this then leads him to ask his next question. What is that purpose? It doesn't matter anymore whether flying saucers are real or not. It still matters to me, of course, as an individual scientist. I have often stated, and I still believe today, that UFOs are real and technological. When I say it doesn't matter whether they are real or not, I am speaking of their social impact. You will find scholars who will prove to you that the supernatural powers of Jesus Christ never existed. But you can also find scholars who will prove to you that they did exist. Does it matter? Of course not. It only matters to the experts who have staked their academic reputations on either side of the argument. The effects of the belief in Jesus, the impact of the doctrine based on the story of his life and death, are real enough. Socially, historically, the consequences are beyond question. I claim that the same now applies to flying saucers, because enough people believe in them, enough people believe that contact with them is possible, and enough people even believe that they have secretly achieved such contact. It is too late for science. The social, the historical, and political consequences of the spreading belief in contact with space are here, and they are real, no matter how ludicrous and bizarre they may appear. The point he makes about Jesus is so pertinent. I don't know whether you believe that Jesus was real. People have a difference of opinion about that, whether you believe that he was the Son of God, whether you believe that he was just some preacher, maybe a historical figure, maybe you don't think he existed at all. But actually, does it matter? In the Time list of the most influential people of all time, Jesus is listed as the number one. So even if you believe he doesn't exist, it doesn't matter, right? The reality of him is bigger than his historical existence. And I mean, in the case of Jesus, we literally define time based on when he was born. It's the year 2025 because based on that calendar, it's 2025 years since Jesus was born. That's the way that we literally measure history. That's how influential he was. So it's a really good point. Rather than just asking whether people exist or certain phenomena exist, let's look at the social consequences. And as Vallee begins to look at those social consequences, he makes this incredible statement. And I had to pull this quote out because I believe it really represents the critical point of this entire book and of quite a lot of Jacques Vallee's thesis and hypothesis on the UFO phenomenon. It's just wonderful. So let me read you this one. I propose that the UFO we see is, among other things, a device which creates a distortion of the witness's reality. That it does so for a purpose, which is to project images or fabricated scenes designed to change our belief systems, and that the technology we observe is only the incidental support for a worldwide enterprise of subliminal seduction. I believe there is a machinery of mass manipulation behind the UFO phenomenon. It aims at social and political goals by diverting attention from some human problems and by providing a potential release for tensions caused by others. The contactees are part of that machinery. They are helping to create a new form of belief, an expectation of actual contact among large parts of the public. In turn, this expectation makes millions of people hope for the imminent realization of that age-old dream: salvation from above, surrender to greater power of some wise navigators of the cosmos. I love this quote. And later on, we'll hear him build on this, where he talks about this idea that we need to get away from thinking about flying saucers, UFOs, as craft designed to get extraterrestrial beings from planet A to planet B. Instead, Vallee sees them as craft designed to get a person's mind from one state to another state. So this isn't about space travel, it's about mind travel, it's about mind alteration, and this is the fundamental purpose of the technology in Vallee's eyes. Now, he hasn't given you a compelling argument for this yet, but what I love about this is that Vallee is so confident to articulate what he thinks. I don't know about you, be keen to hear this in the comment. For those of you who've read Vallee, like I said, I've read through 8 of his books at this point. Very often it feels like he asks really amazing questions, but he doesn't necessarily give you a really clear articulation of what he thinks. And here we've got it. I propose that the UFO we see is, among other things, a device which creates a distortion in the witness's reality, and that it does so for a purpose. Hey guys, it's Jason Samosa from the future here, interrupting your viewing experience. If you would just give me 1 minute, it would mean the world. This is the second time I've uploaded this video. The first time it took off in a way I could never have expected. I have been under the radar for 2.5 years, just making videos about topics that I care about, doing research, and doing it because the 200 or 300 people who would watch would give good feedback, and I genuinely was happy with that. Uploading this video the other day, I got a level of feedback I was never expecting, and it's been absolutely amazing. It's been so fantastic, and I'm so grateful for the experience, so thank you for watching. But I'm also disappointed. And the reason I'm disappointed is just as this video was really taking off, YouTube basically shadow banned it and restricted it. The reason they've done this is because of a rule they have that is important, which is that mentions of certain topics and certain words they associate with problems. There is a word that was used and is used later in this video, about 35 minutes in, which was used in a purely educational context in a way that's genuinely important and helpful for people to understand. I've had to silence and remove that word in this new version, but sadly, despite my attempts to explain this to YouTube, they basically just restricted and banned the video. And as a consequence, loads of people have been trying to watch it and they just can't access it. I've had to re-upload and start from scratch. It's okay, it's not the end of the world, but if you're enjoying this video, if you appreciate this content, and if you think this is a good thing that more people should see, can I just ask you to like, share, subscribe, and to do all those typical things people ask you for? Because it would just help me fight back against the YouTube situation, and would hopefully help get this video back out to the audience that it was at before. And if you don't want to do those things, I respect you. You owe me nothing, and I expect nothing from you. If you want to do it, I'll be extremely grateful. My name's Jason Samosa, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. Vallee is convinced at this point. 50 years ago, he's convinced that UFOs are purposefully trying to alter our reality. Off the back of this, the next question to ask is, what is the social impact that the UFO phenomenon is having? How is it changing people's minds and their belief systems? And therefore, how can we understand the motivations and intentions of this phenomenon and the beings or people behind it? And Vallee answers this question during the book. He looks at many different cases of people who've had contactee experiences with these beings and what they've begun to believe and the things they've begun to do. He also looks at examples of people having kind of mystical experiences through cult organizations as well. And this is quite important. Vallee doesn't just see the UFO phenomenon as a disc in the sky and its beings inside. He sees it as part of a broader set of sort of mystical experiences and how they affect us in modern day history, but also in ancient history as well, which we'll come to a little bit later. And having looked at all of these different experiences, Vallee boils it down to 4 different social consequences. There are actually 6 listed at the end of the book. There are 4 listed in the middle of the book. I found that kind of confusing. So I've done my best to smush them together. So I'm going to give you 4 examples here of how this phenomenon and people's experience of it is changing them and changing the culture around them and starting to change society too through those contactee experiences. He gives 4 examples. Firstly, intellectual abdication. Vallee says, the contactee propaganda undermines the image of human beings as masters of their own destiny. The belief in UFOs widens the gap between the public and scientific institutions. Irrational motivations based on faith are spreading hand in hand with the belief in extraterrestrial intervention. And later on in the book, Vallee sort of builds on this, so I'm going to quote from there, where he describes the belief in these terms. The widespread belief that human beings are incapable of solving their own problems, and that extraterrestrial intervention is imperative to save us in spite of ourselves. The danger in such a philosophy is that it makes believers dependent on outside forces and discourages personal responsibility. Why should we worry about the problems around us if the gods from outer space are about to solve them? As we see our world fall apart around us, as we see it happening, is there a part of you that kind of thinks, if they come and land, maybe they're going to help us. Maybe they're going to save us. Maybe they're going to reveal everything and turn this around. I sometimes feel like that. And even with this whole 2027 myth that's been building up, this idea that contact is about to happen, we might view that and think, oh, maybe they're just going to come and they're going to sort everything out. Or we might view it in terms of, well, what's the point in trying to solve anything if they're coming back? The whole thing pushes responsibility away from us and makes us kind of passive. Rather than being active in the world and in the study of this phenomenon, we kind of give up and we say superior beings are coming. What's the point, right? What's the point in buying a house? What's the point in doing this? What's the point in investing in trying to change our politics if they're on their way and if they are the ones who have all the answers? That is a really interesting social phenomenon. And I actually do think that to some degree we see that within the modern UFO movement. On to Vallee's next social consequence, which is racist philosophy. He says, the pernicious suggestion that some of us on the Earth are of extraterrestrial descent and therefore constitute a higher race. The dangers inherent in this belief should be obvious to anybody who hasn't forgotten the genocides of World War II, executed on the premise that some races were somehow purer or better than others. Further on in the book, Vallee states that contactee philosophies often include belief in higher races and in totalitarian systems that would eliminate democracy. This should be a pretty obvious theme that we're seeing in our world everywhere. Whether it's obviously in Nazi Germany in World War II, which Vallee alludes to, or whether it's what we're seeing happen in the Middle East, where things are really done in terms of lineage and genealogy and race. This idea that certain races are superior also appears in our conceptions of Atlantis and Atlantean beings, something that Tom DeLonge spoke about quite a lot, which is kind of alarming.
And in some of those stovepipes, they've come to the conclusion, this is what's so crazy, but I'm going to say it, that Atlantis was real. And something was very important about that time frame and very important about who the humans were at that place.
This idea that there were people from back then who were able to do remarkable things and that perhaps they're still around, right? There's this race, this lineage of advanced beings. Who's related to them and who isn't? Or perhaps who is related to which groups of non-human intelligence? What does that mean in terms of the value that people have? Another example of where this has appeared is the concept of starseeds, where people believe that they have a connection to non-human intelligence that other people on the Earth don't have. I've heard people describe themselves as starseeds before in my normal everyday life, and it's not viewed as racist, which is remarkable, right? This idea that some people are more naturally elevated in some way from birth is prevalent in this philosophy, and it's certainly something that pops up again and again and again. What is our relationship to non-human intelligence? What is the relationship of the other people to non-human intelligence? And how does that change the way that we perceive the value of different people? And how might that enable genocide?
Those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed.
The next social consequence that Vallee highlights is technical impotence. He describes it as such: the statement that the birth of civilization on this planet resulted not from the genius and ability of mankind, but from repeated assistance by higher beings. The belief expressed by the contactees reveals a tragic lack of trust on their part in human ability. This isn't dissimilar to the first point about intellectual abdication, but it's actually a really important point to highlight, not just in terms of the UFO phenomenon, but just in terms of belief in religion in general. And that is that when you believe in a higher power, whether it's a non-human intelligence or literally God or, whatever it is, you start to believe that the world is fundamentally shaped by them and that human history has been driven by them. And this changes your perception of what human beings are capable of. And that's a really big deal. If you don't believe that you're capable of solving your own problems, then you're going to stop doing them. And I'm going to give you a really personal example here, which comes from my time being a Christian, being a really serious believer, and trying to grow and trying to overcome some of my addictions and my habits. And actually, because I believed I was fundamentally sinful, I never made progress with dealing with those addictions and habits. And in Christian theology, you're encouraged to believe that Christ will transform you, but you also have to hold in contention this idea of transformation with the fact that you are fundamentally sinful and you can't change yourself. And guess what? I never did. I was unable to overcome a bunch of addictions and habits that were really frustrating me. But when I left the church and I began to believe in my own inherent value and my ability to change, guess what? I did. What we believe about ourselves and about the world and about our capabilities as species transforms what we believe is possible in terms of today, right now, and changes what happens in the world. And I think this is incredibly important. The point that Vallee makes here is that if you begin to believe that only extraterrestrials can save us, that only non-human intelligences could solve these problems, then of course we're never going to be able to solve the problems that we have here. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that non-human intelligence doesn't exist, but it just highlights that perhaps part of the mechanism of the UFO phenomenon, one of its social impacts that it's engineered to create, is to stop us from thinking about how we can solve our problems and to start encouraging us to rely on these other beings, whoever they are, to solve them for us. It makes us impotent. It makes us weak. It makes us reliant. And that is something that Vallee wants to highlight in this work. The final point that we'll raise in terms of social outcomes is social utopia. Vallee writes, increased attention given to UFO activity promotes the concept of political unification of this planet. Fantastic economic theories, including the belief that a world economy can be created overnight and that democracy should be abolished in favor of utopian systems, usually dictatorial in their outlook. Later in the book, in chapter 4, Vallee actually documents a contact experience by a man who called himself Aurelian Real. Apologize if I've mispronounced that. But this is what the beings told him. So this was someone who was having one of these experiences, and it links to this social utopia, democratic transformation idea. You must eliminate elections and votes that are completely ill-adapted to the current evolution of mankind. Men are the useful cells of a large body called humanity. A cell in the foot doesn't have to say whether or not the hand should pick up an object. The brain decides, and if the object is good, the cell in the foot will profit by it. A world government and a new monetary system must be created. A single language will serve to unify the planet. I think this is super interesting in terms of how we think about communism. I don't know about you, but when I hear world leaders and politicians talk about communism, they almost talk about it in terms that are, it's not just that they see it as a bad economic system, they almost see it as like a spiritual worldview which is evil. But maybe that makes a bit of sense when you hear Vallee talking about how this is a consistent theme, this utopian ideal that all human beings can come together. And then you hear this specific case of contactee experience where it even sort of describes the dehumanization of individuals, the de-individualization for the sake of the whole, this kind of hive mind mentality. You are just a cell in this utopian ideal, and that democracy and your individualism and your individual perspective cease to matter in the context of this bigger vision. When Tom DeLonge came out, having spoken with these insiders and these government advisors, they told him, number one, that the UFO phenomenon was bad news, but also that it had a hive mind.
The UFO phenomenon has a hive mind. These creatures, they potentially don't have souls. They're like clones, and they worship their own technology to some degree, because they cannot stand the frequency of elevated human consciousness.
Right.
So what's the best way to keep us from elevating our consciousness? You crash a craft and the transistor pops up, and you get video games and iPhones and all these things that you walk around like what? A cyborg.
Right.
A soulless little hive mind, all getting direction from devices.
Isn't it interesting that they talk about the UFO phenomenon in those terms? That it's maybe in some ways doesn't respect our individualism and what makes us human, and instead wants to absorb us into this kind of hive mind mentality, and that's bad news. And how that aligns with what Vallee's saying on these contactee experiences, this idea that we're just a cell in the body and that this is a social utopia and a vision that we should aspire towards. Now, one more beautiful quote from Vallee on the UFO phenomenon before we start to pivot in the narrative of his argument. The technology of the UFOs is not designed to carry little men from one physical planet to another. It is designed much more simply to trigger the already existing imagery we are all carrying in our brains. It is the imagery of magonia, of intelligent beams of light, of dialogues with strange creatures, emerging fully armed into our local universe, like Athena being born from Zeus's head. The UFOs do nothing more than provide the physical support for our own dreams. We do the rest. Our brains erect a ladder of symbols toward the darkened skies where the strange machines hover, and we meet them more than halfway across the bridge of their strangeness. Perhaps because we vaguely perceive that their irresistible, pathetic adventure is our own. When I studied philosophy at university, we covered the theory of knowledge, which is also known as epistemology. And in the theory of knowledge, one of the things that becomes really clear is that it's almost impossible to distinguish between the hallucinations of the mind and reality. When we have dreams, sometimes they're so vivid, it's hard to tell that they're not real. And when people have hallucinations, the reason hallucinations are called hallucinations is you can't really distinguish them from reality. The brain is capable of projecting images that we can't distinguish from reality. And so all we really know is that we're collecting sense data, and we have to trust that it's coming from a real external world, because our brain could project images based on those sense data that may be completely disconnected from it. This is why philosophers distinguish between phenomena and the noumena, the phenomena being our experience of the world, and the noumena being the actual world in itself, which we don't have real knowledge of. And this is really important when we think about this quote from Vallee, this idea that our brains erect ladders of symbols that meet the UFOs halfway. Our brains are very good at projecting holographic images, right? At projecting ideas which may not be reality. That's part of what our brains do. So what if the UFO phenomenon manipulates that? What if it takes advantage of the fact that we can't have direct experience of things in themselves, but instead have to filter everything through our brains to create an experience in our mind's eye? Super important, very interesting. As Vallee continues to move through the book and build his narrative, he talks about how these contactee groups who have these quite extreme beliefs could quickly gain power in the context of a large-scale UFO phenomenon event. The point that he's making is that these UFO groups, these UFO cults, these true believers, these contactees shouldn't just be perceived as kooky groups who have no power and believe strange things, but instead should be perceived as being on the brink of massive influence. Because the moment the UFO phenomenon becomes real, the moment the UFO phenomenon appears in mass in an undeniable way, the government loses its authority. Because they haven't put out a meaningful explanation, credibility in authority figures, whether it's the government or the news media, would immediately plummet in the face of a mass interaction with UFOs, and the status of these contactee groups could rise up massively and quickly, suddenly releasing all of these ideas into the public in a way that would be uncontrollable. And Vallee highlights this as something that should be taken very seriously. As well as this, Vallee also highlights that contactees don't just believe extreme and fanatical things, they also sometimes participate in extreme and fanatical behaviors. In one of the most remarkable encounters described in this book, Vallee goes to visit a group called the Human Individual Metamorphosis Group. And this group has been founded by two individuals who claim to have been incarnated into this realm of existence to help humanity graduate up through this next level that they're supposed to be going through. And he attends one of these groups to try and understand more about what they believe. And he sees all of these young people getting sucked into a sort of a mindless absorption into these ideas. This idea that you need to have faith, that you need to trust, that you may have been thinking about this stuff, and the reason you've been thinking about it is because you're supposed to come here today in this moment. You're supposed to be here. This kind of manipulation which stops you from evaluating the situation logically and gets you to engage with it emotionally. Do I feel trapped? Do I feel lost? Now, this chapter is very interesting, but what is most remarkable is that this book was written in 1977, and the Human Individual Metamorphosis cult and group would later be renamed Heaven's Gate. Many of you will be familiar with Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate is that cult which had a mass suicide in the 90s. All of the members believed that a spaceship was arriving, trailing the Hale-Bopp comet that was flying through the solar system at the time. They believed a spaceship was trailing that, and that in order to be brought on board, they had to commit a mass.
It's the largest in United States history, and it has all the components of just being so bizarre.
It's been 20 years since 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult were found dead, their bodies discovered under purple shrouds inside a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe.
I just want to let everyone know how lucky and happy I feel to be here.
In exit interviews videotaped before the mass suicide, members appeared calm and full of peace.
We have no fear. We're proud and looking forward to what's ahead.
The fact is that there is only one kingdom level.
The cult's leader, Marshall Applewhite, known as Doe, also left behind a message to explain their journey.
If I would title this tape, it would be Last Chance to Evacuate Planet Earth Before It is Recycled.
Vallee's point is this: these cults are dangerous. It's not just fanatical belief systems, it's fanatical outcomes and activities. And the UFO phenomenon, with all of its sophistication, might be trying to generate these activities. And it's not just mass suicide, it's also murder. Vallee states, contactees are occasionally capable of extreme actions to propagate their beliefs. They may be violent and unpredictable. For example, in the 60s, according to conversations I had in the Soviet Union, a leading plasma physicist was pushed under a Moscow subway train by a contactee who had been instructed by a voice from space to kill that particular man. In 1975, a French contactee was arrested by the police as he was entering the headquarters of the French television network, carrying a carbine and 50 shells. A similar voice from space had instructed him to kill a newsman who had written several books on UFOs. Do you ever wonder whether some of the extreme actions that we see in our world may actually be the result of non-human forces whispering to people? And what we describe as people having imaginary or hallucinatory voices in their heads may actually be, to some degree, real, triggered by interactions with this contactee phenomenon. The mass phenomenon is an awful thing to behold. The number of people who are going and slaughtering innocent people. And when we talk about non-human intelligence being real, or this phenomenon trying to change the way that people behave in society, do you think that people within the program might have studied the relationship between mass killings and the UFO phenomenon? We definitely know from the likes of Dr. Colm Kelleher and other people who were involved in the ORSAT program that the phenomenon spreads like a contagion. That if one person has a contact experience and then goes and spends time with other people, it can spread from them to those other people who can then have paranormal experiences. The interesting thing is that scientists have also found the same thing in terms of mass murders. There's a study that's been done that shows that a large proportion of these mass can be understood as a contagion, as something that's spreading through society, not just as random isolated events. Similarly, when you look at the people who were involved in the Reagan, Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative program that was developed in the 80s, something that many insiders have hinted at being some kind of defense system that was created to protect us from the UFO phenomenon. So this was a program designed to build a defense system to help us protect ourselves from these craft, from these phenomenon.
And we started working like crazy with the brightest minds, with huge amounts of money, with just with passion and with resilience and with everything at our disposal to come up with a way to protect everybody. There are massive programs underground and in other places to create a global defense system. Largely, a lot of it was done in the 80s. The SDI, the Reagan Star Wars Defense Initiative, was part of it. So these guys went into complete secrecy to start coming up with a defense system against this phenomenon.
A surprising number of those SDI scientists were murdered. And to this day, it is an anomaly. People don't have a good explanation about how it happened. There was never a foreign government who was truly implicated in it. And it's just an interesting example. We see Jacques Vallee here talking about this case where a plasma physicist was killed because someone had a voice in their head telling them they need to kill this specific man. An individual involved in advanced research was killed. And then we see with this strategic defense initiative, I think it was 22 people who were killed involved in that program in all manner of different ways. Was it some foreign government? Or might it be another government, a non-human intelligence interfering with our world affairs, using contactee experiences as a mechanism to get control of people, to speak to them, to whisper to them, and to drive them to extreme actions? Now, at this point, we've got a pretty good grasp of Vallee's core thesis here. This is not extraterrestrials coming from space. It's something else. And what it's trying to do is impact how we think about our world, about our place in the world, and to lead us to quite extreme outcomes. But here's something important to consider. In this book, it's not until the very end that Vallee talks about what he calls the control system hypothesis, which is a lot more prevalent in his other books. And he only in very brief passing mentions the fact that this phenomenon probably goes back further than World War II. And these are really important things to talk about because I'm assuming you're not just here just to learn about messengers of deception, right? It's interesting to understand Jacques Vallee in general. So I want to make a few important points here. What is the control system hypothesis? The control system hypothesis is best understood through Vallee's analogy of a thermostat. So I don't have a thermostat in my house, but as I understand it, a thermostat is set to a specific temperature. Let's say it's 21 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I'm a Celsius guy. If your house goes up to 22, 23, 24, the thermostat kicks in, it realizes that the score is not where it needs to be, and then it uses the air conditioner to bring that temperature back down to 21. If your temperature drops below 21, so 20, 19, 18, the heater kicks in and pulls you back to the state that you're supposed to be at. As a person, you can configure your thermostat to the ideal temperature, and it's got these mechanisms which then kick in to pull you back to where you need to be. Vallee's hypothesis is that the UFO phenomenon, or the vast majority of what we're encountering in terms of the UFO phenomenon, because there may still be extraterrestrials, probably still are, whizzing about, but the majority of it is a control system. It's like a thermostat. That when human beings change the way that they think, the way that they operate, perhaps we start to advance or unify in certain ways. The UFO phenomenon begins to appear more. It begins to affect society in this sort of clandestine, strange, bizarre way. And that this then pulls us back into a slightly more irrational or religious worldview. He doesn't describe it in those terms so much, but I'm just drawing from what he's already said with this control system hypothesis, the way that I see it. The idea being that if we get too rational, too unified, if we start to make too much progress in a certain direction, this control mechanism kicks in and pulls us back to this slightly irrational, tribal, foolish way of thinking by having all of these strange experiences. And I think it would be fair to say, although I can't think of a passage where he says it explicitly, that Vallee would say that perhaps ancient religions are a consequence of this mechanism, of this control system, where we had these strange contactee events with higher beings, which led us to, religious worldviews, which led us to tribalism, which led us to conflict, and that's all part of the mechanism. It's a very interesting hypothesis, and that then also highlights another important point, which is that Vallee sees this same phenomenon occurring throughout history. So it's not that Vallee simply sees this as happening post-World War II, and that it's a recent phenomenon, although it seems to have dialed up recently. Right? The control system seems to be kicking back in. He sees this as a phenomenon which is consistent across ancient cultures as well, and contactee events with fairies and with other beings that are documented throughout history there is a surprising correlation between the experiences that you would have being abducted by fairy people and that you would have being abducted by what is described as an extraterrestrial in the context of the experience. Very important things to bear in mind as we think about Vallee, this control system hypothesis, and about the fact that this phenomenon goes way back in time. In the second part of this video, we're going to be talking about what I think is the most compelling thing that Vallee has to share in Messengers of Deception and indeed in his wider works. And that is the possibility that this UFO phenomenon isn't just some ancient system left here by some non-human intelligence, but that some parts of it may in fact be being simulated by human groups today. In the latter part of the book, Vallee meets with certain people and gets access to certain knowledge that leads him to believe that indeed there may be a human manipulator behind some of the UFO phenomenon that we're seeing today. And he explores why that might be the case and what their intentions may indeed be. And believe me, you want to hear what he has to say. It is fascinating, but it is also alarming because it changes the way that we think about the UFO phenomenon today. I hope to see you there for the next one. I hope you found part 1 useful. My name is Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time, cheers.